Hello, welcome to The Conversation on News Central Television. This is a program where we bring you up to speed with all the political happenings on the African continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.
And I am Rita Omodia. Elections are still around the corner in 2023, just like in 2022. And we begin discussions today in Zimbabwe, where elections are scheduled to take place this year, although no specific date has been set for the poll.
We'll also be discussing the protests by lawyers in Tunisia over a tax hike and legal services contained in the new finance law introduced by the government of Kais Saied.
I mean, it's just the beginning of the year and we're still seeing protests. We had protests continuing in Sudan. Even though the military government has talked about a transition to democracy, the civilians are still insisting that they do not want a shared government, but they want a purely civilian government. And right now in Tunisia, we're seeing protests continue. Last year, we had parliament, suspension of the parliament. We had even parliamentarian strike, and we had lawyers. And right now, we're seeing a hike in the taxes.
I really wonder what it will take to reach a compromise in Sudan, because the protests have been ongoing for quite a lot of time.
Too long.
And it does have serious economic implications. But we begin in Zimbabwe today, where Zimbabwe is gradually gearing up for its general election scheduled for this year. In 2018, elections took place on July the 31st, although no particular date has been given by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. It has been projected that the 2023 polls will be held either in July or August. In spite of the uncertainty, political parties have begun to hold rallies and campaign activities in various cities and towns.
While preparations continue with the hope of a free and fair election, the economic crisis exacerbated by hyperinflation has continued to destabilize the polity. The ZANU-PF has been in power since Zimbabwe's independence, hoping to extend its rule over the southern African country, but that might not come easily. Top challenger Nelson Chamisa formed the opposition party Citizens Coalition for Change, CCC, last year to contest Emmerson Mnangagwa's presidency. Will the outcome of the 2023 election bring the needed relief for Zimbabweans? Well, this will be our focus on today's conversation. As we have joining us for this conversation, we have Linda Simgurira Masarira, President, Labour Economists and African Democrats. We also have Sydicks Muradzikwa, I hope I got that correctly, is a political and governance analyst, and they are both joining us from Harare, Zimbabwe. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the conversation.
It's my pleasure to have me here.
Wonderful. So I will begin with you now, and we're trying to understand the situation at the moment in Zimbabwe. So how would you describe the political atmosphere and mobilization in Zimbabwe presently? We have not heard of a specific date, but we know that between July and August are from precedents that this election will hold in 2023. So what's the political atmosphere at the moment?
Okay, thank you very much. What I can say about the political environment currently in Zimbabwe is that political parties, they are fully aware that there's going to be an election this year, 2023. But as you alluded to, there is no definite date which has been set or announced by the president according to the constitution, because the constitution gives the mandate to the president to announce the date, but that has not happened yet. But as we can see, the mood for political rallies, for political contestation or participation of political parties is still very low. There are no active, much of the activity which is happening in the political arena, but to some extent, some political parties are on the move. They are doing some campaigns. But generally speaking, we cannot say that the mood is now, the political parties are now in the correct mood or in the correct gear, which is expected, especially at a time when we are saying we are looking towards to have elections by mid or on the second quarter of the year.
Now, Sydicks, your country, Zimbabwe, has a checkered history of elections characterized by violence. What measures are being taken by the authority to ensure a violence-free election season? Is 2023 likely to witness the same fate?
Okay, on paper, the authorities in my country, they do preach about peace, they do preach about having violent-free elections, but normally that is not what will happen on the ground. And over the years, a lot of empirical evidence have pointed that the same authorities are those who perpetuate violence, are those who are responsible for perpetuating the acts of violence, particularly pre-election, during election, and post-electoral violence. So nothing has been done concretely by the authorities who are responsible in dealing with the political violent activities. But all I can say is we expect, there is a lot of expectation that this election is going to be marred by a lot of contestation, a lot of political violence, given what is currently obtaining in Zimbabwe. There is a lot of indication that the election is going to be a bloodshed election, which I can say the election, the authorities are solely responsible. It is their sole responsibility, because they do fan a lot of violence. They do propel a lot of divisions amongst the people themselves, among the society. So actually, violence is something which is going to happen in this year, particularly in the elections that are on the current looming, unless something is discussed by these authorities who are in power, who are normally the perpetrators of the violent acts and violent decisions which affects the country and the political divide.
Okay, Sydicks, I'm going to follow up on what you say, because it's not a very wonderful news you're giving us, kind of saying that we're still going to have violence in this year's election when there are a lot of expectations for this year. I mean, we had elections in Kenya and Angola, even in countries where there are violence prone, but we saw a bit of change. So I want to have the reaction of the electorate. What's the mood like for them? Because you talked about political parties. Are they looking at any focus for 2023, this year's elections, or are they nonchalant, or is there a form of voter apathy from the electorates?
Look, the main reason why I'm saying this election is likely to be marred with a lot of controversy and violence is, if we take a closer look on the last year's by-elections, which were held across the Zimbabwean body politic, or the Zimbabwean country, we witnessed a lot of scenes of violence, whereby the CCC movement, formed by Nelson Chamisa, was formed only on the 24th of January last year, 2022. But 18 of its political rallies were thwarted violently by the authorities, by the police, by the state instruments. So taking that, giving a clear-cut view from what happened last year, there are a lot of indications that the political mood, or the pose which the presidential pose for this year are likely to be marred with a lot of violence. I'm taking that because there is a history of violence in this country, and like I was alluding to before, I was saying the authorities, they are there, they do preach a lot of peace, they do talk a lot of peaceful campaigns, but in actual fact, when the time for politics and electoral campaign has come, we will witness a lot of violence. So I'm speaking from an authoritative point of view, using empirical evidence on the recently held elections in Zimbabwe. So the mood is actually currently telling that there is going to be a lot of violent activities in the Zimbabwe. And
judging by what you see on the ground. Now, let's move on and talk about the opposition. In several tweets last year, Nelson Chamisa, the leader of the Triple C party, seemed confident in replacing the ZANU-PF government of Emmerson Mnangagwa and introducing a new governance culture. Does the opposition pose any threat to the ruling party, and what chances do the other political parties have in this upcoming elections? Or is it likely going to be a two-horse race between ZANU-PF and the Triple C party of Nelson Chamisa?
Clearly, since the post-millennium, the politics in Zimbabwe, or ever since we attained our independence, the political contestation in Zimbabwe has been between the main political party, the ruling political party, which is ZANU-PF, and the MDC, which later on morphed into a Triple C as led by Nelson Chamisa. So clearly, I have no doubt that this election is going to be a contestation between Nelson Chamisa and President Mnangagwa. That is beyond any reasonable doubt. There is no chance of having another political player who is going to be a force to reckon with in this coming election. So in terms of the chances of Nelson Chamisa, if the elections are going to be held with electoral reforms, I know they prepared, Nelson Chamisa prepared a document which he launched about electoral reforms, which is called the prepared document, and they are actually propelling ZEC to accede to their
demands. I believe. Sydicks there. Okay, I think we have some connection issues with Sydicks, but interesting conversation so far, especially talking about the propensity of Zimbabwe to be violent. I mean, he's not a doomsayer, but looking at the things he sees on the ground, I think he has, like I said, the empirical evidence. And something instructive he said is the government on the surface will preach, no violence and all of that, but you know how elections are in Africa. And he said the ZANU-PF are other ones who perpetrate this violence.
Well, I don't want to point at the ZANU-PF. Anyway, that's what he's saying, because there's one side receiving violence, another person giving violence. So somehow it's either two of you are also active in the violence. I wouldn't have wanted that for Zimbabwe, looking at where the history of Zimbabwe from Robert Mugabe to Emerson Mnangagwa, you know, the history of independence. And we're moving towards an era, especially in the politics, in African politics, where elections have to be more peaceful. But so far, I think...
But Sydicks is not a prophet, so let's hope that violent prediction doesn't happen. We have Sydicks back. Can you complete your thoughts on your previous line?
Okay, I was just giving a political prophecy, as though I'm not a prophet like what you are saying.
A religious prophet, yes.
Yeah, that's a political prophecy. Anyway, I was making a point on whether Nelson Chamisa has the odds, or whether Nelson Chamisa has the odds of retaining power in this election. But clearly, as I was saying, I was looking at a point whereby I was saying Nelson Chamisa in this party has got some chances in terms of winning the electoral polls in Zimbabwe. But as long as we are in Zimbabwe, we don't have the reforms which has been preached about since the 2018 elections. If ZEC does not accede to those reforms, clearly ZANU-PF is going to win the elections. And ZEC has failed to accede to the electoral reforms which the different political players and political parties are demanding. So as we all know, ZANU-PF he has captured all the state institutions, including the ZEC, which is supposed to be independent. The judiciary is captured. So having that in mind or into cognizance, it will actually favor ZANU-PF. And ZANU-PF, the fact that it controls those institutions, these independent institutions, it can't reform itself out of power. So the fact that, or if ZANU-PF accede to the political reforms, the electoral reforms, it will definitely mean that they are weakening their ground they are standing on. So definitely, as long as we doesn't have the electoral reforms, surely I can guarantee you that we are not going to have any other political player other than ZANU-PF and President Mnangagwa retaining power in 2023 again.
Okay, now, Sydicks, while all odds and the structures being captured by ZANU-PF seem to favor the party, we know that in February last year, the European Union renewed sanctions on members of the ruling ZANU-PF party and added government's arms manufacturing company, that is the Zimbabwe Defense Industries. Now, in September, the Police Deputy Commissioner General, that is Stephen Mutamba, was also added to the list. Now, while all structures have been captured by the ZANU-PF, how much of an impact has this had on the activities of the party and also in Mnangagwa's administration?
Okay. There was a general assumption that in 2018, when President Mnangagwa assumed the power, the general assumption from the people of Zimbabwe and the rest of the world was that he was going to establish a competitive authoritarian developmental state, which was going to propel a lot of change in Zimbabwe. But that did not happen because of several factors. So in terms of the regime trying to control power, they've made sure that they've controlled each and every facet of all of the state institutions in Zimbabwe. Like the ZEC has been captured, the judiciary has been captured, all the state instruments, state apparatus, including the police, the CIO, the army has been captured. The army factor in Zimbabwe is also a major variable that should not be ignored in our Zimbabwean body politic, because they know that if they have control of these institutions, these players in our politics, they will retain power, political power. And the devastating effect of that has led to the decaying or to economic collapse, the breaking down of the social contracts. We no longer have a rule of law in Zimbabwe, and the immediate political consequences of that has been sanctions, like you are saying. The United States of America and the countries based in the global north have imposed a lot of sanctions, and currently Zimbabwe is attempting to rejoin the Commonwealth. The Family of Nations, the Committee of Nations was actually deterred or was actually fruitless. It was a futile effort just because of the state capture, the corruption, and so forth. So particularly the capturing of the critical state institutions in Zimbabwe, he has actually invited the sanctions, and Zimbabwe right now is being isolated, is being excluded economically, politically, in the region, in the global at large. So that has been actually the devastating effect of that.
Okay. Now, Sydicks, still staying on the subject of these sanctions by the European Union and the United States of America, the ZANU-PF government has always used the subject of sanctions as a boogeyman. It's an excuse for while the economy is failing, why teachers are not getting what they want as salaries. If you just ask any government official, why is this the case? They point to sanctions. What impacts have sanctions had on the socio-economic development of Zimbabwe, and what are the prospects for its removal?
The question of sanction in Zimbabwe, its impact to the survival of the state as a whole, is actually the one which is debatable. But truth be told, the sanctions in Zimbabwe are just a rhetoric. When this ruling regime amassed power in 2018, or from Robert Mugabe through the military coup, they preached that the sanctions, a mantra, cannot be a factor to blame the failures. Robert Mugabe was surviving using the sanctions mantra, and they debunked themselves. They debunked that the sanctions are not responsible for the economic quagmire or economic crisis or dilapidated socio-economic fabric in the country. But as time and the politics begin to unfold, they reverted back, they slided back into that sanction mantra. So the sanctions mantra has been used as a tool by the ZANU-PF to actually hoodwink the public, the masses of Zimbabwe, so that they would not be blamed for their own failures. The sanctions in Zimbabwe are actually the targeted sanctions on the certain individuals who are perpetrators of violent acts, who are perpetrators of mass killings, and they do have some cases to answer. Look now, the senior members of the army, the senior members of the police, those are the ones who are currently being targeted by the sanctions. And certain individuals within the party, those are the ones who are targeted by these sanctions, not Zimbabwe as a whole. And to make this clear, Zimbabwe itself is the biggest buyer. The EU and the America, they are the biggest buyer of tobacco in our country right now. And we are talking of sanctions. Why is it the sanctions preachers, they do have a lot of money, they are building mansions everywhere, offshore in our country and abroad, but those who are made to believe the sanctions are wallowing in abject poverty. So we cannot argue that Zimbabwe's current situation is because of the sanctions. This is purely bad bad governance and economic looting and corruption purely.
All right, you've mentioned clearly that these sanctions are rhetoric, and from the statistics we have there, we had that inflation was estimated to average 213% in 2022 and will remain in triple digits in 2023, while Zimbabwe has more than $10 billion in external debts. Now, you've clearly established the fact that the reasons for all this is bad governance. We also see and we also hear of electricity rationing going on in Zimbabwe. So how are the people being able to handle these situations, inflation, hyperinflation, and even electricity rationing?
The people in Zimbabwe, generally, we are very passive. We have got passive people who fear a lot in terms of the violent activities or the nature of their government. So when citizens are living in constant fear of their own governments, this is what normally happens. So Zimbabwe, as people say, they say Zimbabweans are very peaceful people, but in actual fact, this is negative peace. Which is currently in our country, because the Zimbabweans, they know once they try to do protests, they will be killed, as evidenced by the recent killings of the 31 August. The army factor in Zimbabwe, they are very swift and they quickly intervene into any protests or any people who want to register dissenting voices. So the very government, the ZANU-PF government is very swift in terms of thwarting dissenting voices in Zimbabwe. That's why the people of Zimbabwe, they are just wallowing in abject poverty, as I alluded to. They don't complain, they just cope with the situation. So kudos to the Zimbabweans in terms of the general survival. They eke out a living out of nothing. They don't complain, they try, no matter how difficult the situation is. But truth be told, people are prepared, more than prepared, to vote this regime out of power. That's why they do a lot of power backup in terms of capturing the state institutions, the military, and so forth. So the people of Zimbabwe, actually, they are wallowing in abject poverty, and the general person in Zimbabwe is living under 34 cents a day. So actually, that is testament to the fact that the people of Zimbabwe are suffering just because of the bad governance and economic quagmire which is in the country.
Thank you, Sydicks. I would like to bring in our second guest on this discussion, Linda Singarai Masarira. She's the president, Labour economist and African Democrat. She joins from the Zimbabwe capital, Harare. A warm welcome to you, Linda.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all the listeners and viewers.
Now, Linda, how are political parties in Zimbabwe approaching the campaigns, and what are their strategies in the lead up to the general elections this year? Very important elections. And how would you describe the general mood in the country as we inch towards the elections in Zimbabwe?
The mood generally is that we've got a very tense political economy. We've got a very polarized political economy, and violence between political parties started during the by-elections earlier last year. And that is a real cause of concern, because elections should not be an electoral cycle that is characterized by violence. Because differing in political opinion or ideology doesn't mean that we should become enemies. We should use that as a platform to unleash terrorism, to unleash violence against each other. So what is important right now is for political parties in Zimbabwe to be able to restrain from violence, to be able to be tolerant of divergent views, and to be able to campaign peacefully. I think that is what is really important as we start our campaign in 2023. And political parties are preparing for their campaigns, and right now most political parties are busy with the delimitation report that was unveiled by SEC about 2 weeks ago. And the parliament has started deliberating on the delimitation report, which is actually a very contentious issue as well, as some constituencies in the ZANU-PF stronghold have been migrated into the urban areas, and ZANU feels that will be short-changed. And opposition also has a lot of queries in regards to the voters roll and the allocations of the new constituencies and wards. So there's just a lot of things that are happening in our political economy right now.
Okay, now, Linda, it's time that you brought about the issue of the economy, and I can see that you are the president, Labour Economics and African Democrats. Now, earlier on, we mentioned the fact of the inflation rising in Zimbabwe. We also talked about electricity rationing going on in Zimbabwe, and Sydicks highlighted the fact that bad governance is one of the major effects. Now, has this become a propelling factor for the electorate towards the 2023 elections?
Sadly, I don't see a massive voter turnout this year's election because there's a lot of voter apathy. The electorate is very disgruntled. I think you've read in the press that MPs, deputy ministers and ministers were given hefty loans towards Christmas. And a lot of people are not viewing this as politicians are using them for power retention, for primitive accumulation of wealth. And this happens in both opposition and the ruling party. So this is a real cause of concern because there's never been serious political will, political sincerity for transformation, for development in our country. We've always had MPs, councillors from both opposition parties, the ruling party, this is here just to make sure that they fill their pockets at the expense of the development that people want to see, at the expense of laws that protect the interests of the people of Zimbabwe.
Now, stay with you, Linda, before we move to Sydicks, and I'm directing this question to you because you're a woman. In the 2018 parliamentary elections, women candidates won only 26 of the 210 constituencies. And although 4 women ran for president in 2008, none managed more than 4% of the vote share. Has there been any marked improvement in female participation in politics in Zimbabwe?
I think 2018 elections had quite a high number of women participating to be MPs, to be councillors. But one of the biggest challenges that women face in Zimbabwe is misogyny, patriarchal dominance. That is why some of us had to create political parties that create spaces for women. Because in the mainstream political parties, they favor the men against the women, and women are always used as tokens in these political parties and really don't have a voice that other women can actually stand with and say, we've got this representative in this particular political party that is led by a male person. So we've been working flat out, we've been working so hard to ensure that we bring forth a new political trajectory that views women as equal and capable candidates during elections in Zimbabwe. It's work in progress. It's not easy. It's not an easy walk in the park, but what has to be done until we achieve gender equality, which is enshrined in Section 17 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe.
Okay, now, Sydicks, talking about this election, earlier on our former submission, we gave the fact that there's been no exact date for the election, but we do know that most likely it will be in July and August. So what have been the moves by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission towards the election? What has been given? What's the information so far given to the electorate concerning the election?
Well, the issue of the announcing of a specific date is actually a constitutional prerogative of the president. No matter there is this talk of saying the elections are going to be held this year, whether in June, July, or August. But no one has the powers to announce the date, to give a specific date, and to announce to the electorate. That is solely the constitutional mandate of the president. The president is the only one who proclaims the date of the election. So we are actually waiting for the president of this country, according to the constitution, to proclaim and to pronounce the date of the harmonized polls. But when it comes to the issue of ZEC disseminating or preparing the electorate, it's currently doing its work according to its constitution. They are preaching the gospel of registering to vote, registering for young people, the elderly to vote. They are actually disseminating and distributing information about delimitation, but which is, again, an issue which is being contested by so many election experts in Zimbabwe. The issue of delimitations. Today and yesterday, they actually publicized a document which they are doing a lot of delimitation, which doesn't make sense to a lot of political experts in Zimbabwe and electoral gurus in Zimbabwe. They're actually doing a lot of political gerrymandering of constituencies to favor a certain political party. So it is said by the experts and the pressure group, which is well known in terms of analytics of electoral data, which is Tim Pachedu. So ZEC is actually supposed to give the reasons and to defend its position in terms of what the election gurus and experts in Zimbabwe are saying, particularly on the issues or which relates to gerrymandering of constituencies, which is actually being done, which is said to be done to favor the ruling party, particularly in Manicaland and Masvingo provinces, to be precise.
Now, Linda, let's talk about the opposition. We do know that Nelson Chamisa left the MDC to form his Triple C party, but the main opposition MDC party, led by Douglas Owanzora, what are the expectations for this party in the 2023 elections?
I didn't quite clear your question. Can you come again?
Yes, I said Nelson Chamisa broke away from the MDC. The MDC used to be the main opposition party in Zimbabwe under Morgan Tsvangirai and also at Nelson Chamisa, but the party still remains. So what is the MDC led by Douglas Owanzora? What are its chances in this 2023 elections?
From my perspective, when I look at the 2023 harmonized elections, I'm not seeing an overall winner, and I'm seeing most parties that are going to participate getting a certain percentage that will lead to maybe a formation of a government of national unity. Because a lot of people are disgruntled and people want to try new things. People are tired of the same old tricks, the same old lies, lack of development, lack of decent salaries, lack of proper hospitals, etc., etc. So I see people being woke and trying to try something different and diversify our political economy. We have had a two-party system for a very long time, which has yielded no positive results for the ordinary Zimbabwean. And next year's election, this year's election is going to be a game changer. Because people are going to vote for aristocracy. That is what I see. That is the general feeling on the ground where people are saying, we now need to vote for something tangible, change that we can see, change that we can hope for. So I think everyone has got a chance in this coming election. It's just the hard work that needs to be put on the ground.
All right, thank you so much, Linda. Now, Sydicks, I'm going to give you another question that which is closely to that, because we see lots of protests going on in the health sector. We talked about labor, we talked about electricity. What are the expectations for ordinary Zimbabweans as we inch towards the 2023 elections in Zimbabwe?
Obviously, we have to accept or come into terms with the fact that the Zimbabwean situation is actually going to the unprecedented levels. The issues of electricity, the issues of clean water, the issues of the health service and other service delivery in the social sector of the society and of the government. Surely, it is beyond any reasonable doubt, any shadow of doubt, that Zimbabwe is going to the unprecedented levels of failures in terms of the electricity and the social aspects, like what I have alluded to. But the general people of Zimbabwe, they actually anticipate, they are hoping for the best in terms of the government, in terms of turning around this bad situation. The people are just hoping that the government can make the situation better in terms of improving the electricity in the country. Like there are some activities and initiatives which are being taken by the government at Hwange, at Kariba. They are trying, but we all know that the government is actually overwhelmed by several factors which are leading to the failures. In terms of the health, the people are just expecting for the change. But as I delved into before earlier on, I talked about the reason why the people of Zimbabwe are going to vote for change. It is because of these failures of ZANU-PF government in terms of providing its or living up its expectations in terms of the 2018 electoral promises. It promised a lot of people or the masses in this country that there's going to be electricity across the country, but that has not happened. There's going to be a general improvement in terms of infrastructure development. That has not happened. If it has happened, it has happened partially. The general conditions within the hospital, the health sector has been dilapidating a lot more and more every day. So that is one of the reasons why the masses are going to vote for change, and change is going to be denied by the government and by its the government and its cronies and institutions.
Thank you, Sydicks. I'd like Linda to have the final say here. Zimbabwe is not a country in isolation. The Zimbabwe people, its migrant workers, are also a big issue in the SADC region for Botswana and also the Republic of South Africa. Recently, in the just concluded ANC conference, I believe it was the ANC Secretary General that endorsed the ZANU-PF in the upcoming elections. What do you make of that? The both independence parties, ZANU-PF and also the African National Congress. What do you make of that endorsement from South Africa?
I think we have to be brutally honest with the truth that it has not been easy in Africa to remove revolutionary parties from power. And a lot of people still resonate with those revolutionary parties. And I hear a lot of opposition political parties in Zimbabwe saying people will vote for change, people will do A, B, C, D, and E. Yes, there are a lot of extenuating factors, but we also forget that 70% of the electorate in Zimbabwe resides in rural areas, and that is the revolutionary party's stronghold. And as long as we have almost penetrated the rural areas, it is not going to be easy for us to remove ZANU-PF from power. I'm a realistic and pragmatic person who wants to power. All opposition parties in Zimbabwe still have a lot of work to do to penetrate the rural areas in our country. And ANC and ZANU-PF will always support each other as revolutionary parties. And that is one thing that we can never change. We've got a lot of work to do. We just cannot sit back and say, because there are a lot of negatives that are happening in our country, as opposition, we're going to have an easy election. It is not like that. We've got a lot of work to do. And if we want that change to come, we have to be prepared to work very hard against all forces.
All right. Thank you so much, Linda, for that submission. Of course, we're looking forward to the president giving the date for the election. And of course, even though there still talks about an election, a violent election, we're hoping that all parties come together and bring forward a free and fair elections in Zimbabwe for the good of the people. Thank you so much, Linda Sungurirai Masarira, President, Labour Economics and African Democrats. Also a very big thank you, Sydicks, Muradzikwa, Political and Governance Analyst, both joining us from Harare, Zimbabwe. Thank you so much for joining us on the conversation.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching The Conversation on News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll be looking at the political situation in Tunisia. Do stay with us. We'll be right back.
News Central TV, Africa's #1 storyteller, has come with the best of both worlds. With a combination of news app and live TV, we ensure that you keep track of the latest headlines, breaking news, and in-depth analysis from professional journalists from around the continent. Download the News Central TV app on Android and iOS and get started today. Don't forget to follow us on News Central's social media platforms. News Central, Africa First.
Welcome back to The Conversation on News Central Television. In the first half of the program, we did look at preparations in Zimbabwe towards their general elections coming up this year. Now it's time for us to switch gears and move to the situation in Tunisia, where thousands of Tunisian lawyers embarked on a protest on Thursday to voice their displeasure at the new taxes imposed on legal services by the government as part of the 2023 budget. Lawyers, led by the head of the Tunisian Bar Association, Hatem Mziou, declared a day of rage and gathered at various locations across the country, including outside the Palais de Justice in Tunis, to reject a hike on legal taxes fees from 13 to 19%.
The 2023 budget, which was unveiled last week, increases taxes on companies as well as on professionals such as doctors, lawyers and architects in a bid to boost the country's revenues. But the Bar Association argues that the new finance law is unjust and will be a heavy burden to disadvantaged clients who will be made to bear the burden of the new tax.
نحن هذا يوم غضب فيه حمل للشارع كامل اليوم وفيه وقفة احتجاجية من الساعة 9 إلى 11 صباحا، ولكن رفضنا أن نكون معطلين لمصالح المواطن. نحن اليوم ما عملناش إضراب وليس في نياتنا الإضرابات، وحتى تحركاتنا التصعيدية إن لم يتم الاستماع إلى مطالبنا بتعديل هذا القانون المالية وحقيقة الاستماع إلى مقترحاتنا اللي تمثلوا في 50 نقطة إلى وزارة المالية واللي شبهتنا.
Interesting development there happening in the country that is known for the beginning of the Arab Spring, for starting off the chain reaction that became known as the Arab Spring, Tunisia. 13% to 19%, Rita. Is that much of a hike?
That's much of a hike. I mean, just even 1% is much of a hike. I know when I was looking at this story, I wondered whenever governments are looking for revenue, somehow they come back to the people. Now, they talked about hiking taxes, not just even for the lawyers, even for the professional doctors' services. Now, this affects the people. We understand that most times governments are looking for a way to create revenue, but we don't see them cutting their own budget. Somehow,
exactly.
the money has to come from the people.
And you know what? They always say the judiciary is the last hope of the people. And I wonder why, of all places, to look for revenue to shore up the economy, they have to go into the legal profession. Of course, the lawyers, they will get their briefs, and it's the people, like you said, that will feel the trickle-down effect of this hike. And you know what it means? That disadvantaged people will not be able to seek legal services, and it does have serious implications.
I wonder if it's actually a very conscious effort from Kais Said, who is actually also in the legal profession, because we saw last year, constitutional lawyer, we saw last year suspension of the parliament, a sacking of the judiciary, and all sorts of manners that are affecting the legal proceedings of the country. And we also saw a constitution which he said was for the people, but somehow we didn't even see the impact of the people in that constitutional reform. So it's more like Kais Said is somehow taking everything for himself.
Now, knowing the character of Kais Said, because these lawyers, they've called for a day of rage, they're protesting, they're not happy with this decision. Knowing the type of person Kais Said is and the things he's gotten away with in the last year, like he suspended parliament, he's almost like a democratic military government. Would we say that this protest will have any impact, and will this hike be reversed? What do you think?
Gbenga, your guess is as good as mine, because we saw lots of protests from the lawyers and somehow nothing. It seems like Kai's side is somehow untouchable. And I do praise the resilience of the people in Tunisia, just like in Sudan. No matter what happens, they still come out and protest and say their mind out and say, okay, we do not like the way things are going.
Yeah, but what's the point of protesting if it's not going to change anything on the ground?
That's the advantage of democracy, the fact that you can come out and say, okay, look at what you're doing, it's so wrong. Unlike when you're in a military government and you cannot come out and protest. So they have the right. People, just like we're seeing, that they are not happy with things like this. So.
And I mean, you have to give kudos to President Kai's side, because unlike Sudan, which you mentioned, these protests that have been happening since last year hardly have any casualties. They've been largely peaceful. And you have to give kudos to the government for exercising restraint and recognizing people's right and freedom of protest.
Yeah, I mean, Kai's side is not a young man in terms of politics in Tunisia, and we've had lots of people, even people from his inner cabinet, complaining about the way he's handling government. But he's saying that he's coming because he wants to change the way the government has been in terms of corruption, which has affected Tunisia. And while all this is going on, we're seeing lots of international partners backing away from Tunisia, because it also affects the economy. When we see strikes, it's not just institutions that are striking. We also see a flip back in labor, and especially in economic development in Tunisia. And we've seen all this protest, and I would not say that it's very good for Tunisia at this point in time.
Yeah, but the government needs money. It needs 5%. It needs to reduce its deficit GDP to near 5%. Where is it going to get this money from? I believe everybody should be taxed, and lawyers are part of the economy.
It's easier for you to say. Just imagine that for your services now, there will be a high tax on it. Well,
it's for the greater good of the country.
Definitely. Yeah. I'm sure Kai's side will also be saying the same thing too. In Tunisia, of course, we'll continue to follow discussions in Tunisia, the progress of democracy, elections going on in Tunisia, constitutional reforms, and of course, the strength of public institutions in Tunisia. Unfortunately, this is where we'll draw the curtains for today's edition of The Conversation. Earlier on, we discussed situations in Zimbabwe, where we are gearing up for elections. And apart from Zimbabwe, we also have elections in Nigeria coming up. So The Conversation will be bringing you all details concerning all this.
Thank you very much. I'm Gbenga Aborowa.
And I'm Rita Omodia. See you again next week.
Bye-bye.